Hi, I would like to invite you to attend our second annual Eucharistic Congress here in the Diocese of Tyler. We are going to host the Congress this year on June 9th and 10th at Bishop Gorman High School in Tyler. Our theme for this year is One Lord, One Faith, One Baptism. We will have keynotes in English by Dr. John Bergsma from Franciscan University of Steubenville and in Spanish by Bishop Daniel Flores from the Diocese of Brownsville. To register or to find more information, you can go to stphilipinstitute.org. Thanks. In this episode of the St. Philip Institute podcast, I'm joined by Deanna Johnston, our Director of Family Life, and we're going to have a very intense discussion about the Second Vatican Council's teaching on marriage and family life. We're going to zoom in on just 5 paragraphs of this document and really open up what's the practical import of the Council's teaching for families today. One note, in this episode, by the nature of its content, we're having a little bit more mature conversations than we might otherwise, so exercise a little bit of caution depending on who's listening, who's within earshot. I hope you enjoyed this conversation.
In the name of the Father, and of the Son, and of the Holy Spirit, amen. Eternal Father, you called St. Philip the Evangelist to open his mouth and begin with Scripture. Tell the good news of Jesus Christ. By virtue of our baptism, we too are called to work for the salvation of souls. Instill in our hearts the zeal of St. Philip, that we may convert hearts and minds to your Son, Jesus Christ, our Savior, who lives and reigns forever and ever. Amen. In the name of the Father, and of the Son, and of the Holy Spirit. Amen.
Hi, welcome back to the St. Philip Institute podcast. My name is Luke Arredondo, and I'm the Director of Faith Formation here at the St. Philip Institute. And I am joined in this episode by my colleague, special guest, Miss Deanna Johnston, who is our Director of Family Life. Deanna, I'm really excited to have you for this conversation. Do you want to introduce yourself just a little bit for the audience?
Sure. Yeah, as Luke said, I'm the Director of Family Life. I've been in the Institute for about 5.5 years. And my primary job, well, first and foremost, is as a wife and mother. We have baby number 5 due in hopefully 8 weeks. And in the Institute, my primary role is to focus on helping couples become saints. As we know, in the Institute, we really focus on building disciples in East Texas, and Bishop really wanted us to have a special focus on marriage and family. So a lot of what I do is marriage formation for engaged couples, also moving into ongoing formation for married couples, because there is always something new to learn, and then developing resources for natural family planning, fertility awareness, education, and whatever else the bishop throws at me. So
when I was coming to work at the Institute, Deanna, and you know this, like I read the Constitution on Teaching that the bishop issued in 2017. Deanna was one of the first people hired, the first person hired to work at the Institute. The founding document is the Constitution on Teaching, and I read that. And I still have the copy, like my first physical copy of it with like all my notes and scribbles and everything. And I realize like every time I go back to look at it that the part of the Constitution I'm responsible for, the like sort of general faith formation, sacrament stuff, is a lot shorter, and there's a lot less kind of like notes where I was like, wow, oh, I could do this, that'll be so awesome. And I wrote that like all over like your section of the Constitution.
Right, section 3.
So I'm not I'm not the Director of Marriage and Family Life, but I could play one on TV if someone had, really desperate need. So it's like one of my hobbies is to be interested in like the work that you do. So, so the reason that Deanna is here to join us on this episode is we're going to be talking about the Second Vatican Council's teaching on marriage and family life that's found in the document Gaudium et Spes. So what I've been doing on the St. Philip Institute podcast for a while now is going through the 4 major documents of the Second Vatican Council. And typically what I'm trying to do is cover like 50 pages of a document or 30 pages of a document or something, in a half hour. And it's just like drive by trying to condense and summarize. This episode is going to be like the opposite of that. So we're going to be zooming in and spending a significant amount of time just talking about what amounts to, let me see, in this printing, starts on paragraph 47 and it goes to paragraph 52, and it's only like 12 pages. So we're going to have a much more thorough conversation about that section of the document. So what Deanna and I are going to do is basically, first I'll offer sort of a summary of kind of what this section of Gaudium et Spes is talking about, and then together we'll have a conversation about some of the particular things, not just that the text actually brings out, but also sort of like the relevance, like why does any of this stuff matter theologically, but also, and this is where Deanna is super, super great about keeping me focused, is how does it apply to the actual lives of married people or people who are preparing for marriage? Yeah. So in the Second Vatican Council, the document Gaudium et Spes is the pastoral constitution on the church in the modern world. Part 1 talks about a lot of doctrinal principles about the foundation of the human dignity of the dignity of the human person and how that sort of grounds everything. Part 2, where we're going to be looking at today, talks about problems of special urgency. And the first problem that the Council Fathers say that they want to discuss is marriage and family life. And the reason that they address marriage and family life, and they tell us in their own words, is because marriage, and this is a quote from Gaudium et Spes, paragraph 51, marriage is the foundation of society. So if we want to serve the dignity of the human person, if we want to serve the common good, we have to ensure a healthy culture surrounding marriage and family life, because those are where these foundational ideas are learned and really passed on. So marriage is the foundation of society, and they say there are a lot of challenges specifically with marriage. Now, this is 1965, which needed to be addressed, and they list a bunch of the problems. And it's really fascinating that some of these problems, maybe all of them, are still around. One of them I think we don't talk about as much anymore because this was the 60s. But this is the list they give us. So these issues are threatening marriage in 1965, and the church says we got to focus on them because marriage is the foundation of society, and right now we have problems with divorce, adultery, polygamy, free love, as well as excessive selfishness, the worship of pleasure, and illicit practices against human generation, which is a sort of very PG way of talking about, abortion and some sort of contraceptive practices. Maybe we don't talk very much about free love today because that's a very 60s kind of term, but I don't think it's the case that that's completely absent from our society. We don't call it that anymore, right?
Right.
So you see that list from 1965, and do you think, oh, well, we've solved those problems? Or do you think they've all basically gotten worse?
They've all gotten worse, and the list is expanded because as you were saying that, it's reminding me of how we're even just having an issue with understanding identity. And what does it mean to be male and female? What does it mean to be human? That we can't even understand that. And just how far we've kind of fallen even since the 60s.
Yeah, and there's a little bit of a sense when you read, especially Gaudium et Spes. It's not the case in every document, but Gaudium et Spes has a little bit more confidence in the fact that we're going to turn this around. This is the modern world, and we're going to face the modern world. And if we can effectively evangelize, we can fix these problems. They don't say it exactly, but you have this this sort of spirit in the text that divorce is a big problem, but if we just rally, we can solve it.
Do it.
Maybe, and maybe that's like me at the beginning of every year. I'm really going to lose the weight this year. And, it doesn't always happen. All right.
Can you remind us what Gaudium et Spes means? Because my Latin is not fantastic, but there's something about joy and hope.
Yeah.
Okay.
So it comes from the opening lines of the document. All Vatican documents are this way. They get an English title or a, Italian title, whatever language you speak, that is derived from the Latin in the first sentence. So the first sentence of the document says, "The joys and hopes, the griefs and anxieties of men of this age, especially those who are poor or in any way afflicted, these are the joys and hopes, the griefs and anxieties of the followers of Christ." So it's joy and hope that is Gaudium et Spes. Spes is hope, Gaudium is joy. So the overall context of this all is we want to participate in the joys and hopes of mankind. And so marriage is one of the key concerns. So In order to respond to these challenges, the council devotes, 5 or 6 paragraphs in part 2 of Gaudium et Spes. And I'll just kind of summarize, like a bullet point style, what is the key contribution of this document in each of the main paragraphs. So paragraph 48 gives sort of an overview of the theological foundations and the meaning of marriage. Like, what is marriage? What is its purpose? Paragraph 49 is a discussion of the concept of conjugal love, which I think we're going to talk a little bit about today. The third major topic under the heading of marriage is the role of children. That's paragraph 50, talks about the role of children in marriage and family life. The next is paragraph 51, which is a commentary on modern challenges with respect to family size. We don't have time to go into like this huge, great story, but we have 2 episodes on the St. Philip Institute podcast where I talk about the document Humanae Vitae. In paragraph 51, there's a footnote that says the church is kind of evaluating modern methods of contraception, and we're not going to take a stance on it one way or the other right now, but we're working on it. And that led to Humanae Vitae. So if you want to hear like a 2-hour story about that, look at the description of this podcast, and we'll have those 2 episodes linked. And then the next sort of major feature is a reflection on what the council hoped in 1965 as the future of marriage, which I don't know that we'll get to, but it's always interesting to me as I've been working through the text of the Second Vatican Council, what kind of desires the church saw for going forward, and like the ways that sometimes we've met those challenges, sometimes we haven't, but that you see sort of there's enduring parts of these documents, and then there's parts of them that are like, well, this is what we hope is going to happen, and if it doesn't happen, well, we can still try. It's not like wow, right. Dang it. But so this is kind of an overview. Deanna, what's your sort of general perspective here on the importance of the Second Vatican Council's teaching on marriage and family life? Like, how does that impact the work that you're doing?
Yeah. And I think it's really interesting that the document speaks of joy and hope, because there is so much darkness. Like we said at the very beginning, like these are the challenges that married couples are facing. And it's only, in reality, I think we would all say it's all kind of gotten worse. But I think the role of documents like this is pointing to the fact that the church has and values the treasure that is the sacrament of marriage, and that it's not just a box that we check, but she understands that marriage is the foundation for society. And sometimes I think we can hear terms like that and they just kind of go over our heads like, oh yeah, marriage is the foundation of it. But no, a healthy marriage can impact, and we talk about this a lot in marriage formation, that the couples we're investing in and we're forming, that those are making up a parish community, and that parish community makes up a larger part of society. And like by building those communities, like that is transformative. Like those things have consequences, and we may not see the fruits of that for decades, or we may not see how that's impacting our children or the people that they will become. But the role of the family is, it can't be underestimated. And so looking at, the church's documents, and especially the Vatican II documents, how she speaks of marriage and family life, it should give us joy and hope that the church is there to support us, but also that the reality of the sacrament of marriage, that the sacramentality of marriage is not just this like pie in the sky idea, but it is actually something that can transform the world. And that's how we make saints, and not just in the procreative sense, but how we convert souls, and that the family plays a key role in that. And that it makes sense that a lot of the challenges and the darkness and the obstacles that we're facing right now are rooted in a misunderstanding of what marriage and family life is.
Yeah. I think that's really good, because one of the things that's interesting is, we know statistically, like, more people, or a greater percentage of Catholics at least, were getting married, in 1965 than that are getting married now, right? And so by like the most basic kind of logic, you could say, well, there were more people receiving the grace of the sacrament of marriage then than there are now. And why didn't all of those marriages just like blossom with like this fruit of sanctity? Why didn't that help to solve some of the problems? Part of the reason I think is what did the formation for those marriages look like? What did it entail? What was the level of understanding that people had as they were entering into these marriages? And that's not to discount the reality of their marriage or the reality of the grace that is available to them. But you need to know what you're preparing for. You need to, if you're not adequately prepared for it, we can only receive the amount of grace that we're actually disposed toward receiving, right?
Exactly.
I make this joke all the time. Like one of my brothers is a ballet dancer, and he's sometimes, given me advice on exercise, and it's like so far beyond where I'm capable of entering into that it doesn't do me any good because I can't even start. So the marriage formation piece is actually, and you have this is a big item now, like the marriage catechumenate. Like the church has had a lot of perspective changes in what it looks like to prepare someone for marriage since the Second Vatican Council, right? John Paul II, even the idea of like a marriage formation program at all was a pretty revolutionary idea when John Paul II was a young priest. It's one of his like unique contributions in Poland was to say like, well, if you're going to get married, like, we're not just going to fill out a form and pick a date. We need to spend some time, working with you. And that's slowly become a pretty universal practice. And now, the Vatican's called for a year of preparation for, or what is there a time limit on it, or just
it's
a marriage catechumenate?
Right, a marriage catechumenate, and it's different models, and I think we are going to have some podcast episodes that really break that open. But basically, like when we're, and in our diocese, we are really intentional about calling this marriage formation instead of marriage preparation, because preparation implies, just getting couples to the altar, and formation is more like we want to get you to the altar and beyond. We want to walk with you through every season of married life, because, oh man, married life is, I've been married for almost 10 years. You've been married for...
Oh, I've got to do math.
Sorry.
2009, so 13 full years, right? Yeah, it'll be 14 in December.
So your relationship has probably changed a lot since 2009. So the way that we're looking at this, or the Church Universal is looking at this marriage catechumenate, instead of folks thinking of this as the church making the requirement longer, like, oh man, you're going to make couples wait a year to a year and a half. Right. Thinking of it more as we have to do a better job because of all these challenges and the reality of married life. We have to do a better job of walking with you before marriage, and we have to continue walking with you after marriage. This whole idea of accompaniment, and I think that is something that the church is getting much better at understanding and articulating, is we have to accompany people in their walk of holiness and in their journey towards sainthood. So instead of us throwing people in the deep end and saying like, oh, we got you to the altar, good luck, helping to step into the reality of, okay, you got married, now you have 2 kids or 3 kids or more, and just the reality of life. And I think that's what I'm really appreciating about when you actually look at the marriage catechumenate document, how it speaks of like the intimacy between marriage and baptism and living out this call, and the role of the church in fostering that call to holiness. But that we have to step into the messiness of people's lives, and understanding that because life is messy, because marriage is hard, and it's okay to say that, that the church needs to be there to continue to walk through the practical realities of people's lives, and through mentorship and things like that. So that's what I'm really excited about with the catechumenate model. We've kind of been following that in our diocese in a certain way, but yeah, I think it ties back to how the church is articulating it in documents like this, of like, if this is what marriage is, this is why we have to protect it. Yeah.
The church historically, if you look back to the late 1800s up to now, has been much more interested in talking about marriage much more frequently, much more, at length. And I think it's a really good thing for the church. I know I was telling you this story recently, but I think it's good for all of our thousands of listeners to hear. My daughter was for some reason looking at lists of saints, or I don't remember what she was doing. She was in the middle of doing something, and she comes to me and she goes, "Daddy, so there's like There's not any like saints who are like they're just like they're a saint because like they were married, right? There's like saints that were martyrs or like they were a bishop or a pope or whatever, but there's not like married saints, I guess. And I was like, no, there are married saints. And she goes, okay, well, what are some married saints? I'm like, Saint Therese of Lisieux's parents, they were married, they're both saints. And others. So I think that like you can even see in our canonizations, the church is a little slow, but it's getting there, catching up on the idea that like we've got to raise up. I can't just arbitrarily raise up a couple and say they were saint, but we've got to find those couples who can give us an image of what's one way that this looks like. Right. And there's if you just look at saints and you say, well, I don't care if they're married or not, just let me look at 100 saints. You will see 100 radically different ways of embracing God's will in your life and living holiness. And marriage is not going to be different than that, right? And so I was talking with my daughter and I said, I think if the church had been paying attention and looking for married saints in the 500s, we'd have more of them, and you'd be able to see this that marriage looks a lot different depending on the individuals, the circumstances. But what's at the root of all of them is this like authentic desire to grow in holiness. So one of the things that I think is interesting is if you were to ask even a minimally practicing Catholic, it doesn't have to be someone who's like, I'm at Mass every week, but someone who's maybe once a month at least, right? They're not just coming to Mass once or twice a year. They're kind of like they're trying. If you just gave them 30 seconds or a minute and a half, you ask them, what is the proper order for your relationships? Like, what are the most important relationships, starting with number one and working your way down? What's the number one relationship in your life? Don't spit the answer out. Think about it for a second. They might be able to realize the number one relationship ought to be with God. It's not, but I know the answer ought to be God, right? They would probably say, the most important relationship I have is my relationship with God. And most people, being honest with themselves, probably be like, I'm not living my life like that, but I know that's how it ought to be. But if you ask those same people, and even people who are going to Mass every week, so I mean, sort of limiting our audience to Catholics, but ask the question, what's the point of marriage? What's the ultimate point of marriage? I don't know if you'd get a very consistent sort of answer to like, it's about this. I think you'd get a lot of more like, it's got to be about something. What's it about though? I don't know. Is it about having a lot of kids? Educating. It's about educating my kids, making sure my kids pray. It's about I don't know what it's about, right? So I think that this is really interesting, and we've talked a little bit about this, just in preparing for the podcast. What is in fact the point of marriage? Answering that question sometimes can be like a super loaded conversation, depending on who you're talking to and what they're expecting as the answer to that. So let's talk a little bit about that. Like, what in fact is marriage about, and how does this document, Gaudium et Spes, help us to see this question maybe in a new way? You want to kind of take a stab at that? Yeah,
actually, I kind of want to throw it back to you because you know exactly where, but we often hear marriage is about the procreation and education of the children and the sanctity of the spouses. And you can probably point to exactly where this is in this particular document, but the challenge that can arise with that is that we put it in exactly that order, that we say it is the procreation and education of the children, and then the sanctity of the spouses. And we can sometimes forget that marriage is a sacrament and it's about the sanctity of the individuals. If that's lost, then the primary purpose of the sacrament is lost there. But can I throw it back to you?
Sure. Yeah. Well, so this idea of marriage being about three things. Like, there's a very sort of reflex answer among people who've spent a little time thinking, okay, I want to read about marriage and learn about it. Like, what does the church teach? You can get to a real quick, like, here's the answer. Marriage is about proles fides sacramentum, right? It's about procreation or having offspring. It's about the fidelity of the spouses to be faithful to one another. And sacramentum, the sacrament, is in third place. that ought to like sound a little weird that we would put sacrament as number 3 and say like the ranking of, but that's a very common way of getting at it. And that goes all the way back to Augustine in you know, one of his document De Bono Conjugale on the good of marriage. And that has a lot of weight, but that's not like the only way that people have explained marriage like throughout the church. What the Second Vatican Council does in a very, very helpful way in Gaudium et Spes is say that, yes, children are indeed, it says, the supreme gift of marriage, not necessarily the purpose. The fidelity of the spouses obviously is important, but the sacrament really is the thing that we need to kind of put our emphasis on. There's an excellent article from the journal Antiphon, a journal for liturgical renewal, by Robert Fastigi, who's I don't know if he still is, but he was a professor at Sacred Heart Seminary. I think he's still there. That's just really, really good about discussing the ends of marriage, like the idea that like, what's marriage about? It's about these 3 things: procreation and education of children, fidelity of the spouses, and sacraments. And in that order, like there's a tendency for us to kind of want to see them that way. And what he really shows is that the Second Vatican Council doesn't use that language, but it's not because it's trying to subvert that, like, prior to Vatican II, everything that was ever written about marriage made it univocally clear. Marriage, first of all, is about procreation, education of children. Then it's about fidelity. I mean, right? You can stop right there and see it's stupid to list them in that kind of order. They're like, well, you got to have children, and then number 2 is then you should be faithful to each other. Right. Like, obviously, there's a handiness of having a list of 3 things.
Yeah.
But when we put too much emphasis on this is the order, you know, it gets a little tricky. Another one of the things that he mentions is that there's a distinction between the goals of marriage, the purpose of marriage, the ends of marriage. Some of these things are complicated. Aquinas talks about natural ends of marriage, which he says procreation and fidelity fall in there, and then the supernatural dimension of marriage, which he says is the sacrament, and that the good of the spouses ultimately is concerned not just with educating and procreating and educating, but the ultimate good of spouses is the sacrament, where we receive grace. We receive the life of the Trinity through the grace of the sacrament of matrimony. There is a grace in having children, but it's not a sacramental grace where you get the divine life because you had kids, right? Married people who don't have children, where do they fit into this? If number 1 is about procreation and education of children, right? So what are some of the ways that you can see maybe some dangers of kind of overemphasizing, you know, one way of seeing it, or the advantages of like really reframing the way the Vatican II kind of takes us and says, let's look at the good of the spouses first. Kind of what are some of your thoughts on that?
Yeah, so what it was reminding me of is the hierarchy of relationships. We talk about this in our marriage formation program when it comes to family of origin, and then also looking at the nature and sacramentality of marriage, that the hierarchy of relationships, like you were saying, like God should be first, and then my spouse, and then my children, and then everybody else. And it's really easy to get that out of order, especially when children enter the relationship, because what can happen is children become the primary thing. My spouse can become second, and then God is somewhere in there. But when children are the primary focus of the relationship, there are consequences to that. One of the things we were talking about before we recorded is that there is this rise in something called gray divorce, where we're seeing couples who have been married for 30 years, 25, 30 years. They've raised their children. The children are now out of the house. They're empty nesters. And there's no foundation to their relationship because their entire marriage has been focused primarily on raising children as the first and foremost thing. And it's very interesting to talk to couples when we bring this up at our engaged couple retreats. The number of couples who have said like, but wait, like aren't children supposed to be the most important thing in our family life? I was like, no, because the children are the fruit of your relationship. And so what we're seeing happen with this rise in gray divorce is that couples are like we said, there's no foundation. And when we have the hierarchy out of order, it leads to things like this, where a couple's like, well, do we actually understand what it means to love each other? Do we actually understand what it means to be a married couple? Because now the people that were our primary focus are now gone. So that's one of the consequences that I see. The other thing is I hear this emphasis on procreation of children as the most important. Children are the supreme good of marriage, and children are a beautiful gift.
Yeah. And to be clear, I'll just interrupt just really briefly. The text of the document here does say that children are the supreme gift of marriage, right? But that is different from saying that they're the supreme reason for marriage. Like that you have, in other words, you don't have a marriage if you don't have children.
Right.
And I think that's sort of the blind spot when you put all your emphasis on procreation as first. What does that mean for someone who doesn't have children? Either they've only been married a little while, but they don't have children. We're like, well, are they married then?
Right.
Yeah, obviously we'd say they are. Like no one's really going to get confused about whether they're married. But if the purpose of it all is about procreation, what about all those cases? And there's all kinds of different ways that this can happen. That people are married and they don't have children.
Right.
What do we say about their marriages? And then what would you say to them personally? And what are they supposed to do?
Exactly.
How do we support them? And I guess the thing Deanna's so great at this when she talks about marriage, she never misses these gaps. I'll think about it and just look at the typical, okay, you got married, then you had children, and everything goes quote unquote normally. Deanna always sees the well, what about these other cases, these cases? I'm like, yeah, you're right. It's not only the case that if we put procreation as number one and we just put all our eggs in that basket and say, this is what marriage is about. It's not only the case that you're kind of overemphasizing something and maybe hurting a group of people who don't have children, but you're at the same time underserving even those people who do have children and that everything goes normally. If they don't have that ultimate grounding of what this whole thing is about,
right,
then you're in that problem that you just described of great divorce.
Exactly. And then we also see things like, couples are stepping into marriage that don't realize that they're going to have to struggle with infertility, that they're going to have to embrace that cross at some point, or secondary fertility. And when we have this emphasis on and maybe it's not as common as I think it is, but sometimes we can encounter this attitude within the church that the holiness of our family is indicative of the size of our minivan, right? How many car seats do I have in my car? Are we a Honda Odyssey family, or do we have the Nissan Envy? Are we, have I reached a certain level of holiness because I have a certain number of children? And I want to be really clear that to have a lot of children is very generous. I'm working on number 5 right now. But I also recognize that the church never gives us a list and says okay, well, if you really want to be a holy family, you're going to reach at least the 3-kid mark. And then, we'll upgrade you to the next level of holiness. There are holy families that are very large, 8, 10, 12, 13 kids. Beautiful. There are holy families that have 1 child. There are holy couples that have not been able to have any children. And so the thing that I see, and I've seen people get hurt by this, I've seen people walk out of talks that are being given where we are talking so much about the procreation and the supreme good or the supreme gift of marriage being children that we can forget infertility is actually on the rise, and so the church is going to have to get even better at about talking about this and accompanying people through that pain. So if the church herself has this attitude of your marriage is contingent upon how many children you have, and that's going to tell us how holy you are. There are struggling marriages that have lots of kids, so we can't look at that as a label to say, we just have to be, I want to be open to as many children as God wants me to have, but that doesn't mean that the church is going to give me that number, if that makes sense.
Yeah.
And I'm sure most of us know that. Like, most of us know that the church is not going to, like, there's not a secret paragraph in the catechism or in Casti Connubii.
Is there a decoder ring for reading Humanae Vitae?
Right, exactly.
You shine it the right way, and it like reveals, like, oh, look at the ink underneath.
That's how many kids we're all supposed to have.
I'm gonna steal the Declaration of Independence, and it is gonna. And in there, on the back page, if you illuminate, it will tell you how many children you're supposed to have to be holy. That's Nicolas Cage's next movie, I think. It's already in development, and I'm not getting any money. So.
No, it's all good. Or like some Da Vinci Code thing. Like, and sometimes I feel like people approach the church's teachings in this way. Like, you know, you have to reach this level of sanctity, like this number of car seats in your car to be a holy couple. And I just like, I look at that and what the church is so good at, and what I really liked in that article that you mentioned, is that it points out so well how the church's teachings didn't change with Vatican II, but to see this development of doctrine, to see how we have a better understanding of some of these things.
That's really good, actually, to think of it as sort of, and look, this is the document, the church in the pastoral constitution on the church in the modern world. And in the 20th century, more than ever before, the church had heard from the witness of married couples, the witness of families. There had been a real groundswell in, married people forming organizations. There's saints who are, married. You've got Saint Giannamola, and there's authors who are married, writing on marriage from a theological perspective. Dietrich von Hildebrand is an important author in this conversation. And all of this is having an impact on the church being able to better recognize, like in the current context of where we're at, what is the accompaniment that people need to think about marriage. And they realize that putting the good of marriage, the good of the spouses, more to the forefront of the conversation, that's really, really critical for all kinds of reasons. And you've hit on a number of them. We've talked about it, but there are a lot more.
Yeah.
Right? I mean, you could really just say every marriage, every family is going to have its unique reasons why keeping the good of the spouses at the center of marriage really helps to make sense of everything else.
Right.
When the good of the spouses is truly being sought, then you have a good way of discerning, should we have another child? Maybe should we not have another child? And the children themselves are a function of the good of the spouses. Like they contribute to that, right? Having children contributes to the good of the spouses, but the good of the spouses also helps to, kind of evaluate what are we doing with our children in terms of education,
right? In
terms of formation and everything else. I want to point out also something that, again, this is this article by Robert Fastigi, which is really awesome. This is a quote from Casti Connubii, which could be one of the sources that people will point to and say, oh, here's the three ends of marriage, it's right here. But it overlooks this line. So this is from St. Pius XI. This is 1930, December 31st, 1930, written in response to the Anglican Church changing its teaching on contraception. You want to see more about that, check out those 2 episodes linked in the description, because it's a whole 2-hour story. If you think this episode is fun, wait till you let me just tell a story for 2 hours. Okay, this is the quote from Casti Connubii. This mutual interior formation of husband and wife, this persevering endeavor to bring each other to the state of perfection, may in a true sense be called, as the Roman Catechism calls it, the primary cause and reason of matrimony. So long as marriage is considered not in its stricter sense as the institution destined for the procreation and the education of children, but in the wider sense as a complete and intimate life, partnership, and association. So notice this. This is Pius XI, it's Casti Connubii, and he's saying, we've really got to remember that the primary cause and reason of matrimony should properly be said, as the Catechism of the Council of Trent notes, the mutual interior formation of husband and wife. It's formation of husband and wife and the endeavor to bring each other, so the husband bringing the wife bringing the husband, to the state of perfection, which is to sanctity. That's the primary purpose of marriage when you look at it more broadly. Now, does it inextricably involve a connection to procreation? Yes, but even the Roman Catechism, the Catechism of the Council of Trent, says that mutual help of spouses is the primary reason for marriage. So that's really important to bring out. Again, this Vestigi article, so great at helping us see that there's actually like a lot of plurality of ways of explaining marriage. And you can see this in the Catechism of the Catholic Church. If you pull up any individual sacrament, I know you go to the beginning of each sacrament, there's a discussion of what is this sacrament called. And I think it's hilarious that, like, if you look at the Catechism's teaching on the Eucharist, it's like, what is this called? Is it called the breaking of the bread? Is it called Passover? Is it called the Eucharist? Is it called Thanksgiving? Is it called memorial? There's all of these words to use it. What about baptism? Is it called baptism? Is it called chrismation, or not chrismation, but like illumination? We don't even know what word to use to call a sacrament. It's very, very, I think, much more complicated to distinctly say what exactly is the purpose of this sacrament in such a way that there's no other way you could say it. There's no other way you could just explain it. We can't even say, baptism is about the forgiveness of sins, right? Nobody can deny that. Right. But isn't baptism also about becoming a son of God, becoming a daughter of God, becoming a member of the church? Isn't baptism also the gateway to the sacraments? Isn't baptism also about preparing us for a life of discipleship? It's about all of those things, and you can't really say, like, you have to say it in this sort of certain order. So the same thing I think applies about marriage, in that when we want to say what it's about, we've at least got to be willing to say it cannot just be that it's procreation, education of children that must be the way that you start. That's part of the conversation, but in a special way with marriage, procreation and education of children only makes sense within the context of the good of the spouses. If, like you're saying, we understand marriage to be about how many kids can we have, and that's the only thing we're thinking about, that could be really dangerous for the children themselves.
Exactly.
And for the spouses.
Exactly. And as you were saying that, I'm thinking of the vows themselves and how we talk about that, especially in marriage formation. Let's see if I don't mess this up. And I actually like it more in Spanish because it's yo te recibo a ti, I receive you. But in English, it's I, Deanna, take you, Michael, my husband, to be my spouse. I promise to be true to you in good times and in bad, in sickness and in health. I promise to love and honor you all the days of my life till death do us part. Or some version of that. There's a couple of different, I think there's 3 different versions that you can use in the rite or the order of celebrating holy matrimony. And I think about those words, I receive you, I take you to be my spouse. And we talk to couples so often about how powerful those words are. Like, once those words are spoken and the conjugal act takes place, that covenant is formed. And every time the couple engages in the marital embrace, it's a renewal of those vows. I give everything to you till death do us part. And understanding, like, even just this concept of a gift of self within the sacrament of marriage and the sanctity of the spouses, like, we can't undermine that. That isn't a footnote from the church. Those are the words that we're saying on our wedding day, and we renew those vows every time we engage in the marital embrace. And when we only think of, or we start to think of, like, the supreme gift, and a gift is something that is received, it is not taken. The supreme gift of marriage being children. If we only look at our primary goal as a married couple is to have babies. Okay. And we make some really cute babies. But
Deanna's babies are very cute. I can testify.
And so are yours.
I can testify in a scene that the words she speaks are true.
They're ridiculously cute. But if my only job is to just keep making cute babies to the detriment of the sanctity of my spouse, like my job is to help my husband, Michael, to get to heaven.
Yeah.
That is our most important job. If I'm having all these cute kids, but I'm not helping my husband to grow in holiness, or he's not helping me to grow in holiness, then we are not living out the sacrament of marriage in its fullness. And it can also lead to, and this might be a tangent, but it can also lead to a distorted understanding of the sexual relationship.
Yeah, no, that's good. Maybe it's a tangent. No, it's not a tangent because it's in here. It's in...
It's 49?
Actually, this is a really good segue push into this discussion about the notion of conjugal love. So you mentioned the conjugal act, the marital embrace. In paragraph 49 of Gaudium et Spes, if you're playing the at-home game, you want to turn to paragraph 49. There's this really beautiful description of the notion of conjugal love. It's not terribly short, but I want to read some of it. And the idea is this: what Deanna is saying, that if your marriage, if we were to understand marriage to be simply about procreation, and I know it seems like we're like really pushing a lot on that. It's because I think it's one of the most common shorthand ways of answering the question of what marriage is about. It fits for a lot of people, especially at the beginning of their marriage. If they just keep that in mind, that's all they need. It motivates them. They're good. But what's the long-term consequence of that for when you've had your children? Or, well, do we have another one? Well, that's the purpose of marriage, is to have children. And even if you don't have that many, when you get to the end and the children are gone, well, then what? Then what's the whole thing, been about? This notion of conjugal love is actually much broader than merely just like allowing for sexual activity, within marriage. So there's another sort of common, stereotypical view of thinking about sexuality from a Christian or a Catholic perspective that like it's bad until you get married and then, you can do it. And that's really, the church is saying something much more profound. So this is from paragraph 49. It says, the biblical word of God several times urges the betrothed and the married to nourish and develop their wedlock by pure conjugal love and undivided affection. Many men of our own age also highly regard true love between husband and wife, as it manifests itself in a variety of ways, depending on the worthy customs of various peoples and times. This love, and it means conjugal love here, is an eminently human one, since it is directed from one person to another through an affection of the will. It involves the good of the whole person, and therefore can enrich the expressions of the body and mind with a unique dignity, ennobling these expressions as special ingredients and signs of friendship, and signs of the friendship distinctive of marriage. This love, conjugal love, God has judged worthy of special gifts, healing, perfecting, and exalting gifts of grace, and of charity. Such love, the conjugal love that is at the will of the person, from one person to the other person, so it's not an instrumentality. It's not making a transaction out of the relationship or out of any specific act of the relationship, whether that's the sexual act or other acts. Such love, merging the human with the divine, leads the spouses to a free and mutual gift of themselves, a gift providing itself by gentle affection and by deed. Such love pervades the whole of their lives. Indeed, by its busy generosity, it grows better and grows greater. Therefore, it far excels mere erotic inclination, which, selfishly pursued, soon enough fades wretchedly away. And that's really only half of the paragraph, or maybe a third of the whole thing. So much is packed in there. This notion that the sexual act of a man and woman, duly married, we're not talking like just people having sex. Like they came to the church, they had a wedding, and then they have the sexual act. That intimate act of love, right, has to be grounded in a much broader concept of conjugal love that pervades their entire relationship and goes far beyond the fact that they're just now allowed to have sexual intercourse, right? So conjugal love, when you see anything about conjugal in a church document, it's not just talking about the fact that, like, these two people are now permitted to have sexual intercourse, but rather that they're supposed to have an entirely transforming love that makes their entire life an authentic gift of themselves to the service of their spouse for their ultimate goal of sanctification. That kind of rich, profound teaching gets you a grounding upon which you can really build your understanding of the purpose of marriage, even in those circumstances where you're infertile and you're not having any children, or you're dealing with how many more children do we have. Right. If you don't have that concept of conjugal love as the foundation, you don't even know how to ask that question, and you don't know how to find the answer.
Exactly.
If you're just putting the focus on procreation, there's no good way of discerning when do we procreate. The conjugal love has to be there first. It has to endure through the challenging times of having lots of children and get you past that time when you can distract yourself by saying, well, our whole life is about serving our children.
Right.
It never really can be that way, but even if you foolishly let yourself kind of get stuck that way, there's got to be something, guiding you out of that. And I love this line that, therefore it, which is conjugal love, far exceeds mere erotic inclination, which, selfishly pursued, soon enough fades wretchedly away. That line about it fading wretchedly away, really important for people who are preparing for marriage, especially if one of the things that they're, really putting a lot of focus on is like, well, now I'll have a legitimate way of expressing myself sexually with my spouse.
Yeah.
That's not, I'm not that old, okay, but I understand even at 38, you do not have the same kind of appetites, and you're not always going to have the same kind of energy. If that's like the big thing that you're really excited about, that's fine to be excited about it. But you can't imagine that that's what your whole married life is going to look about.
Exactly.
It's going to look like, rather.
Exactly.
And to be married when you're 60 or 70,
it's going to look different.
A very different kind of situation, right? So if it's been either about procreation or about like a legitimate arena for sexual expression, both of those are good. Don't misunderstand us. Those are really important. But they're not the ground for a healthy marriage.
Exactly. And there's so many problems that can sprout from a misunderstanding of what conjugal love is. Because like you were saying, and how what we were talking about, but even before we recorded, that this idea of conjugal love being the same as or equal to sexual love, like if the primary mode of affection is only the sexual relationship, or the marital embrace is the only way that we can express love as a spouse, that's not healthy because there are going to be times where that isn't possible. And it's kind of funny that some couples, like, they don't understand that, and many of them are young engaged couples. This is where I also see this criticism of a marriage formation, like expanding a marriage formation. When our diocese went from 6 months to a 9 to 12 month formation, a common pushback was, well, we're just making chastity harder for these couples to live out because we're making the time longer. And what I hear when people say that is, okay, so we're concerned that they're going to have to wait longer to engage in the marital embrace. Okay. Is this not an opportunity to help them understand what marital chastity looks like, what abstinence may look like in their marriage too? Because that's going to come up at some point. After you have a baby, guess what? Guess what you're not doing for at least 6 weeks? So like having a healthy understanding of what conjugal love is, what the marital embrace is, and that it is so much more than just having children, that it is this gift of self. And we get into like the theology of the body and an understanding of like this free, total, faithful, and fruitful love, because you can be engaging in intercourse, but it not be true, authentic conjugal love. You can be having a bunch of children. And this is where people throw in terms like marital debt. And that's a whole other podcast episode probably, is clarifying what that means and what it doesn't mean. Yeah. But that's where I hear people throwing out terms like that. It's like, well, this is if procreation is the ultimate good of marriage, then, marital debt, like you can never say no, or there's never a reason to not engage in the marital embrace. And it's like, no, because this is so much more. This is about the good of the couple. It's about the holiness of this marriage. And if the pursuit of holiness is the primary target, if that's the thing that we have our eyes on as a couple, then all of these other issues that come up, like you were saying, like those fall into alignment much better. It's so much easier to discern family size. It's so much easier to discern family life things that come up. Are we going to homeschool? Are we going to send our kids to Catholic school? Are we going to send them to public school? How are we going to deal with this or that situation? It's so much easier to deal with the realities of family life when things are properly aligned, when God is the primary focus of our relationship and the holiness of our relationship.
No, I think that's really important. And I know, you've heard me say this a lot of times at Q&A at some of the engagement retreats, but when you get into a question, for instance, about family size, right? Mm-hmm. If you have not properly ordered your understanding of what marriage is about to place God at the center of it, answering that question about whether or not it's a good time to have another child you're just totally guessing, right? It's like me going in my backyard with some seeds and water. I'm like, I'm going to plant a garden because I know what I need is seeds and sunlight and water. I don't know anything about my soil. I don't know what kind of crop, what temperatures, there's all these other things that you need to know. If you don't have that relationship with Christ, that sanctification, that call to perfection as the center of how you understand your marriage, dealing with all of the other difficulties that you're going to encounter are going to be so much more difficult. And I know I can speak personally, like when Elena and I are really taking our prayer life seriously, when we're each individually and as a couple saying, like, I'm not missing my prayer, I'm sticking to it, we're doing this. When we get thrown problems you usually have nothing to do with marriage. It's just like,
life.
Oh, we have this terrible thing going on, another thing. And it's so much easier to just be, it's all right. We're fine. Mm-hmm. But if you don't have that, and then just life comes your way, it's really difficult to make any sense of what to do, how to respond. Exactly. Man, Deanna, I think that we could probably talk for another 20 or 30 minutes. But this has been really helpful, I think, for us to see, like, the teaching of the Second Vatican Council, right? It's not just like some obscure theological stuff that you're like, I don't know what value it has. It actually, and you see this in the Catechism, if you read the Catechism of the Catholic Church, its section on marriage, and you look at the footnotes, a lot of the footnotes are coming from Gaudium et Spes. So it's a really foundational way. It shapes the way that the church is thinking about marriage in this, in this new world that we're in, where it's, as you've said, we've even moved farther from some of the problems and we have newer ones. Mm-hmm. So we need to remember some of these fundamental things. Is there anything you want to sort of say, kind of wrap things up, sort of closing remark?
Yeah, no, well, thank you for the opportunity to break this open. And I think what this conversation has really opened for me is that the church is so wise, and the church loves marriage and family. And even beyond this document, because I know we just talked about a very narrow piece of one particular document. Yeah, that's right. But I'm so grateful for the wisdom of the church and how she gives us boundaries, and but she never underestimates or devalues the importance of marriage and family life. And like going from this document to going to things like Humanae Vitae, or even the writings of John Paul II when it comes to marriage and family life and the role of the family in the modern world, and even looking at documents like Amoris Laetitia and what Pope Francis has said about marriage and family life, that the church is there and she understands why this is the final battle, right? This is the thing that we're all going to encounter. And yeah, I think I just have a deep sense of gratitude for the church, and yeah, looking forward to other conversations, maybe about the marriage catechumenate and things like that.
Let me just close us out with reading the very last couple sentences from the section on marriage and family life, which is describing sort of like a summary statement of what is this all about. This has to do with the future of marriage. So listen to the way that the council describes an authentically formed, family as being actually a key to witness and evangelization, because that's the big work we're trying to do here at the Institute, is to evangelize and catechize. So finally, let the spouses themselves, made to the image of the living God and enjoying the authentic dignity of persons, be joined to one another in equal affection, harmony of mind, and the work of mutual sanctification, which we talked a lot about. Thus, following Christ, who is the principle of life, by the sacrifices and joys of their vocation and through their faithful love, married people can become witnesses of the mystery of love which the Lord revealed to the world by his dying and his rising up again to life. Can't say it any better. Thanks for joining us, Deanna. I really appreciate this conversation.
You.